Hello Planeteers, let's talk about your major planet assignment for this week, and that is the news brief. So a news brief is something that you'll see in a lot of publications. You'll see it in newspapers, on websites, and basically what it is it's a small but complete nugget of news. So for this assignment, 125 to 200 words, that's about 3 to 5 paragraphs. And so the reason why I'm giving you this assignment right now is that it's your first opportunity to really try to write the heart of what your story is really about. Because it's so short, it gives you a chance to be in control of the material. You don't have to try to figure out how to pack 3 or 4 interviews into it. But what you do really need to do is you need to figure out what is the key piece of news that's in your story, because a news brief can really only sustain one major point of news. So in a news brief, the first sentence of the story needs to state very clearly what the news is. So you can imagine that this quite often happens with news stories that you read in the newspaper about something that happened yesterday. You might have a first sentence that would say something like, yesterday Governor Jay Inslee ordered the closure of most businesses in the country, the state, in order to control the spread of the coronavirus. So that would be obviously the major news, and it would also be the first sentence. And then the rest of the story would provide details, additional facts that would answer basic questions that a reader would have. And those basic questions are usually who, what, when, where, why, how, and so what. So you should, when you're writing yours, think about covering those basic facts. So when you think about the structure of the story, the basic structure is going to be the most important fact at the top, and then each preceding paragraph is going to include the next most important information that the reader is going to need. Another requirement for this is that you're going to need to have at least one person quoted in the story. And it's going to need to feel like a complete story, so that when I've read those 3 to 5 paragraphs, I'll feel like I have the basic facts. Now, there might be a lot that's left out in the details, but the basic facts should be there. So I'm going to show you some more details now. One of the key things is going to be the structure of the story, as I've just described. For you, those of you who are journalism students, you'll know the idea of the inverted pyramid is quite familiar. So here you go, inverted pyramid. That's going to be the basic structure you're going to want to follow for this assignment. For future drafts, you're going to want to use a more sophisticated approach, but the inverted pyramid is a tried and true structure for news stories, and I think it's a good place to start. So let's take a closer look. Before you go any further, if you haven't looked at the main Canvas page for the news brief assignment, pause this video, go read it, and then come back. Otherwise, let's keep going. I want to take you through a quick tour of the Planet News Brief template, which is listed on that Canvas assignment, and it shows you an example of what your news brief should look like. In order to get full points, you want to have all this information. This isn't just me being nitpicky. It's very helpful for both me and the editors as we look through a lot of different stories. So for starters, your name, contact information, the name of your story editor, the number of words in the story, not including all of the extraneous words. Offer 2 different headlines that you think might be good for your story. Then underneath that is essentially the source list that you've already created. So you'll have the human sources and the written sources. It should be updated to reflect any new sources that you've gotten from your reporting. The highlights mark any sources that you use in the news brief. Going down below the source list, you'll see here's where the text of your news brief starts. Please double space it to give editors room to edit. And then at the very end, you want to have a self-analysis after the end of the story. That explains what you think is working well and what you think you need to improve on
in future drafts. Here are a few more details. Finally, here's a description of how you should name the file. We get a lot of files sometimes that just say news brief, but we don't know whose news brief it is or what the story is about. So please, it should include your last name, the slug or the name of your story, and then NB so that we know it's a news brief. All right, so that's the basic outline of it. Let's take a look closer at the story itself. We're going to start out by taking a look at what I mentioned earlier in this lecture, the inverted pyramid. This is a very common structure for a news story. It's been around since the 1800s, and one of its original purposes was that if an editor needed to cut the story down for space, they could easily start at the bottom and work their way up and be confident that they were cutting the less important information. So an inverted pyramid is described that way because you start with the most important information and then you go down through the less important information. Let's hope that your story never gets to the boring and dull and 0 point. But you want to have a lead, then very important, then not so important. So when you're trying to decide where to put your information, think about if you cut the bottom paragraph on your news brief, the reader should still have most of the critical information and work your way up to the point where even if they read the first sentence, they would still have an idea of what the major news point was. Now, here's an example of a news brief. This news brief example is on the Canvas assignment page, so you can sit down and take a closer look at it on your own. But I want to walk through it with you real quickly here. This is a distilled version of a longer story. This news brief is 192 words, so it's within the length limit. The first sentence let's look at is the lead. A Canadian federal court ruling Thursday halted approval of the government's controversial Trans Mountain pipeline expansion amid concern for endangered killer whales. Well, we have a pretty clear idea of what the major news is, right? A court decided to halt an expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline, and we even know the reason why they did it. So that is the heart of the news. Okay, so now we move on to a little bit more detail about it. So which court was it? It was the Federal Court of Appeals. And then it found the project's potential impacts on orca whales as well as concerns from First Nations weren't adequately addressed. All right, so that's the reason why they made that ruling. The decision came in response to petitions from a dozen First Nations, the cities of Vancouver and Burnaby, and environmental groups. So now we know who filed the lawsuit in the first place. Now we're going to get into the so what. The decision is a major victory for environmentalists and First Nations groups who have opposed a project that would run 700 miles, carrying 890,000 barrels of oil each day from Alberta tar sands to the coast. Whoops, that is a typo. Fix that. Lose a point for me. Each day from Alberta tar sands to the coast. Opponents have warned that the project would increase oil tanker traffic, threatening the whales. So this is packed with a lot of information. We know about the significance of it. We also learn more about the pipeline. Here's our quote. This environmentally destructive project should never have been approved, and the Trudeau government must stop construction immediately, said Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, president of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. One thing to remember about quotes is that quotes need to be really strong. You think of them like punchlines. You don't want to have a quote that just delivers a bunch of facts. Like you wouldn't want to have a quote from Chief Phillip saying the pipeline runs 700 miles and carries 890,000 barrels of oil each day. Right? That's something that you can just include as a fact in your story. You want to save the quotes for things that really have some emotional punch to them. Then finally, it's a setback for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whose government took over the project in May from the Kinder Morgan Company in an effort to help ensure it gets built. Canadian Finance Minister Bill Morneau didn't say whether the government would appeal the court decision. So you get the other side, you get to hear from the Canadian government, and then finally, at the very end, the story looks forward to what might be coming next. So that's a news brief. It starts with a strong lead, it has a punchy quote, and it has the basic information that a reader will need to understand the news story.
Welcome back. I hope you have all the information you need to have a successful news brief. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me or ask your editor. And remember, this week, you should really be continuing to report because you have the first draft coming up next week. And although your news brief only requires one interview, in order to really understand what your story is going to be and what the facts are, you're going to need to talk to more than one person. So I encourage you to keep reaching out to people, keep interviewing people. The more you do it at this stage, the better your story is going to be and the happier you're going to be when you sit down to write it.